Let's start with what does this not say about you that who Molly Bloom really is?
What does that not say?
Yeah, the movie, the book, all that.
Well, I mean, I think you become different. Hopefully you grow throughout life. It's interesting that you have successes going from failure to failure without losing your enthusiasm, because that was a quote that was at the end of the movie.
Yeah.
Because Sorkin was like, I mean, you're just like one of those things that just keeps running into the wall and keeps running into the wall. And those walls, they hurt, but they teach you so much. And so I think starting at the beginning of my life, the only thing that wasn't my fault, because the rest of them, were problems that I created, but was I was born to this very high-achieving family, and my brothers were like these little evil superhumans, and they just came out, with a path. And Jeremy is a prodigy athlete. I mean, this is a kid who was a 6-time world champion, 2-time Olympian, and then went straight from the Turin Olympics to the NFL Combine and got drafted 5th round. And then at 22, he started this foundation for, granting wishes for seniors in the community. And now he's the CEO of a startup, and they raised $40 million, and they're doing well. And the latest is like he's doing some deal with the Chinese government. That's one of them. The other one was he's a Harvard-educated cardiothoracic surgeon, and he was a genius from birth. And he was placed in my classes doing better than I was. And I'm like, well, what am I supposed to do, And so I started skiing, because in my family, being an athlete was really important. And then I got diagnosed with scoliosis. And I had to go in for surgery, and they fused the top 11 vertebrae in my back together and affixed the whole thing with titanium rods. And the doctors came in the room and said, your skiing career is over. But I wasn't going to accept that. And at 12 years old, I didn't listen to the experts, which taught me a really, really important lesson, which is sometimes the experts don't know the right answer, right? And we're so conditioned that if somebody who is an expert walks into the room and tells you how your story is going to go or how your life is going to go, that we listen to them. And I was stubborn, probably a little stupid, but it taught me this really powerful lesson. And then I carried that with me throughout life. And when I went to LA, it was just kind of to get away from this blown up Olympic dream, because I got injured again, and this time it really was the ball game. And so I got all these weird jobs, and I was working for this kind of over-leveraged, tyrannical jerk who said to me one day, I need you to try to look decent, and I don't know if that's possible for you, and serve drinks to my friends at a poker game. So I'm like, okay. I'm Googling what kind of music do poker players like to listen to, and what do they eat, trying to understand who they were. And I made this really embarrassing mix CD that had songs on it like The Gambler, and there's nothing that screams amateur like, that move. And I show up with a cheese plate, and then these guys start walking into the room, and this was not your everyday poker game. These were some of the richest, some of the most powerful, and some of the most famous men in the world. And I had this moment where I realized that a 23-year-old kid with a cheese plate doesn't generally get this opportunity, to have access to this network, to have access to this capital and to this information. And so I started teaching myself the game of poker. But I also started studying the players and trying to figure out who they were as a group of people. And what I realized were these people were so wealthy, and they didn't want things anymore. They wanted experiences. They wanted to walk into this room and feel like someone else. They wanted to feel like James Bond. It was the fantasy, it was the transformation, it was, in a very lower energy way, the transcendence that he was talking about. And so I built on that. I moved the games to the penthouse at the Four Seasons. Well, first of all, I had to steal the game from my boss, so there was that. But I mean, just
there was that part, right?
Yeah, and that was another time where I think, from a very young age, I got comfortable with risk, and that required doing work on fear. And so at 23 years old, when my boss tried to fire me, and I had realized that my whole life I had been searching for the thing that I was actually good at. Not that I needed or wanted to be good at for the applause, but that I was good at, and that I was an entrepreneur. And that was a huge moment for me, because as entrepreneurs, it doesn't present early on, particularly 20 years ago, when you're good at math, you do this. You're good at science, you do this. You're good at English, you do this. It's a skill set that sometimes presents later in life, and there was no way I was going back. So I had to go up against the Billionaire Boys Club and go up against my boss to try to start my own game. And I was certainly not a favorite at 23, asking them to forego one of their own and bet on me with their money and everything. But I had made a good impression, and I had worked hard and been nice to people and constantly engaged in creative thinking to try to confer value, and it worked. And then I was able to focus on, okay, so now I speak the language of poker fluently. Who cares? What is it really that draws them to this room? And it was these transformational experiences. And so I built on that fantasy. I moved the game to the penthouse at the Four Seasons. I hired a full staff who I versed them on everyone's personal preference, because something I learned from this is do not ever underestimate the value in making someone feel seen, heard, remembered, special. And then I needed to recruit. I needed to find more players, because I had just raised the stakes from 10 to 50,000, because that increased in the adrenaline and increased in the mythology. And I was like, where do I find these people? I can't advertise for this. They don't all, hang out at one place. It's like people of high net worth that have this weird, gambling gene that they're willing to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars in a night. Well, it was Vegas, right? So I went to Vegas and I met with the casino host, and I said, look, I have a deal for you. I have 20 of the biggest gamblers. I'll bring them in. I'll do games for them in the villas, and then we'll go down to the table, we'll go down to the floor, and I guarantee you'll have a weekend where people are playing millions and millions of dollars. In return, I need some names and numbers of people in the LA area. So it was like I was learning how to network. I was learning how to do deals. It was uncharted, and I was just figuring it out. Ultimately, I lost the LA game. There was a player that I butt heads with. It's in the book. His name is Tobey Maguire. He was the villain in my story. He was obsessed with this game. And what he was obsessed with was tailoring and engineering the game so that he could win. And so he would do things like come, play super loose, then lock down the chips, and it was not, that etiquette is not okay. Then I found the straw that broke the camel's back was I found out he was staking a couple of the bigger players. That's collusion. You can't do it. So I had to put my foot down. Again, I knew this was taking a big risk. I knew that he is very smart. He knew how to leverage his celebrity currency. But you got to do the right thing, right? If you're empowered to be in charge, and you've got to make a decision for the group, not just one person, even if it's strategic. And so it ended with this big sort of standoff, and I lost the game. And it was kind of one of those incidents where you're like, you lose everything. Your life can change in an instant. And what do? Well, you fight, right? So I'd heard about players in New York, hedge fund guys, professional athletes that play huge. But it was 2008, and the world was falling apart, from at least on Wall Street. But I still took exploratory trips out there, and I was able to put a game together, and it was 5 times bigger than my LA game. And it was a $250,000 buy-in. And this time I wasn't going to be replaceable. So how did I looked at this equation and said, okay, how can I really be integral in this? Not just the owner, operator, CEO. So I became the bank. And I started guaranteeing the games and extending the credit, vetting these players. I had PIs on, I had banks, I had everyone on my payroll. And it was successful. And now I had the biggest private poker game in the world, and I got really obsessed with that. And my blind spot as an entrepreneur, as a human being, has always been to do things for the applause, right? To try to be way too hooked in to the accolades, to good job, Molly, and the appearances. And eventually that weakness overtook me, and so did the greed, and so did the sort of, I guess, still anger at all the, times that you had been wronged, or I had been wronged. So I was not only running the biggest game now, I was running lower stakes games and PLO games and stud games and expanding to Miami and doing games with A-Rod in Miami, and just, and I'm guaranteeing all this money. I'm out millions of dollars on the street every week. And the games were getting so big, and I saw someone lose $100 million in a night, and this whole thing was just not sustainable. And I started to get really heavily into drugs and alcohol to address staying up and then coming down, and then the emptiness, and it was certainly coming off the tracks. And again, instead of scaling back and making it more sustainable and having that center of gravity within, I had become so addicted and attached to, who this made me, and bigger, and going bigger, and wanting more, and how that, seeking that validation. And as you can tell, this thing is definitely coming off the tracks. And it kind of all culminated with, on the West Coast, there was this player named Bad Brad, and we called him Bad Brad because he couldn't win a hand. He would come, it was like, he was my bet, he was a huge asset, but it got to the point where I was like, Brad, this game might not be for you. He's like, no, I love this, I'm having so much fun. Well, it turns out Brad was taking us because he had a hedge fund, and he got these guys to bet or to invest with him. He's like, my returns are insane, and I'm like an idiot savant for oil futures, and I'm watching all these guys give him money. He can't put a hand together, and I'm like, what is going on here? And so what happened was he got caught, he got indicted for running a Ponzi scheme, and the first place the feds went to try to get the money back is the $5.5 million he lost in the game. So now I'm on the West Coast Fed's radar. Then another really bad decision I made was I found these Russian guys in Brighton Beach, and
there's a lot of good stories that start with that one.
this is one of them. These guys checked out, they looked the part, talked the part, educated, their stories checked out. I was probably not my sharpest at this point, but it turns out they're running the biggest health insurance fraud scheme in New York City history, $100 million. They have ties to Russian organized crime. They're on the New York Fed's radar, so now I'm, both coasts. And then the biggest thing that I did, so I'm being watched, right? And then the biggest thing I did was, I have all this credit out there, I have all this exposure, and I knew the one thing that I was doing to keep myself in this fragile legal area, because I was paying my taxes, I had incorporated, and I wasn't taking a rake. I was not taking a percentage of the pot. As soon as you take a percentage of the pot, it puts you in violation of 1955 running an illegal gambling business. And it's just one night, up too long, written too many six-figure checks, I was like, to my dealer, and that was that. That was all they needed. And, I had run-ins with the Italian mob. They tried to partner with me. I politely declined. They sent someone to my house, put a gun in my mouth, beat the hell out of me, and I was still going. It literally took the IRS, the FBI, the Italian mob, the Russian mob, Department of Justice to shut me down, but that happened. Finally, thank God. And, they sent one of the feds to one of my games, the FBI, they raided it. I wasn't there. I was at a different game. And I, went home, got my beagle, who's 20, been through all this with me, this poor dog. and my money and my clothes, and I just wanted to go home. I knew it was over, but I was scared because what's the FBI doing at my game? That doesn't mean anything good. So I'm on my way to the airport and trying to book a flight, and they said your card's declined. So I log into my account, all seized, frozen in the red. My lawyer called the Department of Justice. They said, we want her to come in and talk to us about what she knows. We know she knows things about organized crime. We know she knows things about Wall Street guys and celebrities. And then we'll talk about giving her money back. And I said no. And I moved home with my mom. I didn't have a bank account. I just moved home, and it was pretty dark. But then I kind of realized that this thing that I was always so afraid of failing spectacularly, of not being someone, of being a loser, of having no money, of everyone knowing that I failed, happened, and I was okay. And that really changed me. And so I was like, okay, this is a mess. My reputation is in tatters. I don't have any money. And I can't do anything with anyone that I've known for the last 10 years. So what do I do? I realized that there was a story here, and that I needed a massive rebranding campaign and reinvention. So the first place I tried to do it was New York Publishing. I got a book deal. They all wanted me to, tell crazy stories and use the names that hadn't been outed, and I just wasn't willing to do that. So I got a small advance, and I thought it was a good place to start. So 2 years it took me to write the book. I'm almost done. I actually had gotten a job in LA at a production company. I moved back. 10 days later, 17 FBI agents, middle of the night, semi-automatic weapons, high-beam flashlights to arrest me. They had spent that 2 years that I was writing my book doing their own research, putting together discovery. And so they put a piece of paper in front of me that says the United States of America versus Molly Bloom. There was a press release that came out that said I was looking at 90 years in jail. I was thrown into a Russian mob indictment. And I had a day and a half to get to New York and find the attorney that's going to take on my case for no money and be a really good attorney. And so I found someone, and I found an absolutely heroic attorney, and I couldn't afford to fight this case. And again, they wanted my information. They wanted my hard drives, they wanted my phone records, they wanted my cooperation, and they even said that they would drop the case. And my rationale here was, I enabled these games. I profited from these games. These people trusted me with their money and their secrets, and I willingly broke the law. One moment, I broke the law. And so I said, I have to stand for these consequences, not on the backs of these other people. So I was looking at 10 years. Luckily, at sentencing, the judge decided that I didn't have to go to jail. And that was great because, look, it sucks to lose your money and it sucks to lose your job. But then when you're looking at losing your freedom, it all goes away. You get good perspective. So I was like, all right, well, that's good that I'm not going to jail, but now what? My book didn't necessarily solve my problems. So I said to myself, who can scale this even bigger? Who, is one of the best marketers out Hollywood? And I come from a gambling background, so I said to myself, look, I know that I knew from listening to guys in the game that were in the entertainment business that the best way to get something done is to have really good content and a really good writer. That's the first step. So, I'm trying to decrease the odds, or I'm trying to increase my odds of success here, because if you look at it, getting something done in Hollywood is pretty long shot. So I started running numbers on people and who was going to give, which writers have the best stats, best odds for award nominations, for box office, and who creates a lot of buzz, but who also writes with integrity and intelligence. And I landed on Sorkin. So I went around to Hollywood asking everyone to introduce me to Sorkin, like, here's my book, can we send this, and people were like laughing me out of their office. But I'm coming from this place now still where I failed, and I don't have any ego about this anymore. I don't care. You can laugh me out of your office, I'll go to the next office. I don't care. And finally, I found an attorney that said, I can ask him for a personal favor. And now, in my conversations with Aaron was like, why do I have to meet with this girl again? Like, who's the poker princess, And so I flew out to LA and had this 1-hour meeting with Aaron. And at the end of the meeting, he looks at me and he goes, I've never met someone so down on their luck yet so full of themselves. And it wasn't that I was full of myself. It's just, again, like, no ego, right? It's either a yes or a no. And if it's a no, that's fine. So that changed my life for sure. And he wrote the movie, and then he decided to direct the movie, make it his directorial debut. And it came out over Christmas, and 4 years ago I was standing in federal court to be probably sentenced to jail, and this year I went to the Oscars, so.
Well, shit, that's
Life
a good
is
one.
good.
That's a great line. Jim Dew, this guy over here, we went and saw the movie, whenever that was, a few months ago, whatever, with our buddy Sean Stevenson, and I've seen a lot of movies this year. It's one of my favorites. It's really well done.
Thank you.
But more than that it's one of these stories of, as we have bonded on the area of addiction and recovery, right?
Yep.
And you're in a world where it's constantly filled with image management, power, money, seduction, drugs, sex. I mean, the whole gamut of stuff. And Dan Sullivan, who's sitting over there, I've heard him say that, people don't get seduced that didn't want to be seduced. And being an addict, there are times where I knew getting seduced was not a good idea, and I knew on some level there's going to be bad consequences, but you play with snakes anyway.
No doubt.
And the more you're around high stimulation, high charge, power, all these external things, you become pleasure deaf to normal human behavior.
Absolutely.
And you keep wanting more stimulation, more stimulation. So what's important to you now is I want to start with, but then I want to kind of break down your perspective of what the hell are people pursuing? What are they looking for in business and gambling? And at what point is it a choice versus you've lost it and now it's addiction and craziness and, mindless pursuit? So
Sure. Well, after I got the project set up with Aaron and spent that 8 months with him, I had the opportunity to really go inside and do some profound work on myself, which I needed to do. And for me, that looked like, and what I did is I approached it like I'm going to apply the same tenacity I applied to business, to sports, to school, to trying to get to a better place. And so what that looked like for me is sobriety, a 12-step program, which the points I love about a 12-step program are you look at yourself, you take a searing and moral inventory of who you've been in the world and what your responsibility is. You own it, you apologize, you move on, and then you spend your life taking this daily inventory of, okay, let me look at my actions. Was I in fear? Was I dishonest? Was I unkind? And then if you were, addressing it at that moment. So for me, that was really profoundly transformative. Meditation, I can't say enough. I mean, meditation I feel like I have a different constitutional makeup. I feel like my brain is different. I have different neural networks. Like, I don't respond in the same way. I don't feel I always felt something was off inside. Even in a room full of people, felt lonely. Even when I was successful, felt not enough. Just this sort of inner turmoil that I don't have anymore. I have it sometimes when something appropriate happens that you would respond that way, but it's not my set point anymore. And I really attribute that to, the work I did at the program, making sure you're of service in some way every day, so that, because like, you want to be miserable, spend all your days in self, right? So I constantly have to think about getting outside of self, helping someone out, my family, so someone that's written to me on social media that's going through something, whatever it is. Meditation has changed my life. I didn't even know how I was going to start with it. I had to start 30 seconds the first day. Honestly, 30 seconds breathing, that was it. That was all I could do. The next day, a minute. The next day, 3 minutes. Then download Headspace, which is like meditation for dummies, because give me optionality and I'm going to go down a rabbit hole. But in doing that and pursuing that and making it this unglorious, just moving the needle forward every day, which is the same way I wrote a book. I don't know how to write a book, just start flexing the muscle, do it every day, train it. I didn't get to be an Olympic mogul, almost Olympic. Jeremy didn't get to be an Olympic mogul skier by, trying this stuff once a week. You train it. And so I just have went this insane transformation that allows me now to find the joy in things that I never found before. I could never understand why people wanted to go to museums. Never understood it. Couldn't get it. Wanted to, intellectually wanted to be there. I went to the Louvre this year, because I went to do all this press in Europe around the movie. I mean, it hit, I was crying. It was so powerful, And finding these joys in everyday life. Like, one thing that I made myself do is, my grandmother is in assisted living. My grandma, to me, has always been boring, right? She was just boring. She wasn't like me. So I went and colored with her every day. I love coloring with my grandma now. I love it. It was teaching myself, rewiring, doing that work, and then teaching myself to live in those smaller moments and be okay and not just seek out those huge dopamine hits that are not sustainable. Yeah. And I mean, I thought when people said these things to me that these were platitudes created by people that couldn't get to these different levels, the consolation. And I was wrong. I was super wrong.
Yeah. When my core addiction was not alcohol, it was drugs first and then sex. And one of the things I remember, but I like going to AA meetings because there's just a lot of good recovery in AA. And I remember in the very beginning saying, I don't want to give up drugs or alcohol or what I do to go sit in rooms to hear people talk about it. It's like, that just seems like a vicarious way of not being able to do it, but you're kind of still there. But still not even at a place where, and you almost, that's the weird thing about going into the unlearning process, because I think when it comes to destructive behaviors or areas of life that isn't working, it's not, everyone that reads books and goes to seminars and stuff is trying to learn stuff. But unlearning is way more important than learning when it comes to that aspect of recovery. And there's a setup period where it doesn't feel good. I mean, it's like, and you just want the dopamine hit, because the thing is, you want the instant hit, the instant stimulation, and it's just, so you actually have to suffer in order to go through one of the, and when I say have to, I mean, maybe people can do it by minimizing suffering, and it always sounds, like they say in 12 Steps, my buddy Tommy Rosen, we did this interview where we actually did it here in this room. And, it says 12 Steps was built by attraction, not promotion. And I have spent my life as a marketer studying promotion, studying persuasion. And the one movement that I admire more than anything has never been built on promotion. It says it's done through attraction, not promotion. But no one's attracted to going into a 12-step meeting. None of it's attractive. It's desperation. And so it's interesting. And if you hear the commonalities of most people in this room here, the ones at least that I know, most of their success first came through a breakdown. It first came through a desperate area. Their life wasn't working. And then they somehow tapped into some resourcefulness, and they just figured it out. And we're all going through our own silent battles and stuff. So you have seen the most famous, the most admired, the highest level people in the most seductive environment that you built and created, not only for them, but for yourself, right? And you've seen the downside of it when it all blows up. So, what what advice would you give to people that are in a success trap, that have the money, the accolades, the fame, but their ego is preventing them to actually getting to the freedom and the life that would actually be more fulfilling to them? Hopefully that makes sense the way I'm asking it.
Yeah, it makes sense. I don't know. I feel like everyone's journey to there is a little bit personal, but I can tell you what really helped me was, just first of all, just starting to seek it. Things start to happen. You start to give directives a bit. But for me, I was like allergic to being uncomfortable. As soon as I felt something uncomfortable, I just needed to change it. And I read a lot of books, some that are like sort of in the Buddhist vein, and then some that are just sort of more unaffiliated about. And this was revolutionary to me, and this might seem obvious, but it was so revolutionary to me that when you feel uncomfortable, it's okay. You just sit with it. You can just breathe to it. You can just let it be there, and then it goes away. My whole life I tried to change it. Another thing that I think really helps me is just this realization that I didn't want to be at the end of my life and have spent that entire time just being about self. Just being for me. Like, how can Molly make more money? How can Molly look better? How can Molly do this? So I realized that I needed to make my life, attach my life to something bigger than myself. And I think when you make that agreement, then you inevitably start to move away from the success trap, because you start to move more towards meaning. And listen, I'm not going to discount being financially successful or being successful. That's always going to be something that's important to me. But now it's a more comprehensive equation of like, okay, but how is this going to be in purpose? How can I use this skill set? I like to be strategic. I like to play chess. I like to do deals. I like to be a little bit, in the dark corners, like making plans. But how can I use it for good? And as soon as I made that shift, then who cares if you fail again, because you're trying to move the needle for humanity, not just yourself. So like, it's larger and more transcendent than self, But also you start to value things differently. So that shift for me was the biggest thing that helps continue to insulate me from the success trap. Like, all this stuff came out, I had offers to host my own shows and to do all this stuff in Hollywood and just be like sort of about this reoccurrent fame thing. And it just fundamentally wasn't interesting to me,
Well, at dinner last night, we were talking about money and the value of it and the importance of it and what you can actually do with it. And so, yeah, in no way, shape, or form am I saying a lot of these things are not, because they're certainly, they're it's huge fuel for stuff. I don't even know if Dean actually knows this, but a few months ago, I was with Ashley, Aaron's girlfriend. She's a Kundalini yoga instructor, and she was helping me move some stuff out of here because I used to have an office in the back. And there was so I was putting some books in my car, and there was a fence in the parking lot back here, and there was a homeless guy that was actually had kind of like a little, sort of like a boom box playing music. And he's like, hey, nice. He's like, do you have any, extra money or any food or anything? And so I said, hold on a minute. Had to put this box down, and I said, I'll be back. And I came in here, and I actually got some energy bars and some nuts and some different food, and packaged up a thing. And like, I just took a bag of stuff, some water, pretty much all of Dean's stuff, and gave it to, I was going to give him Dean's stuff. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, he was just like very articulate and stuff. And I started talking to him. I said, so how long you been homeless? He goes, about 5 years. And he goes, yeah, and it was really hard in the beginning. He goes, what was happening? He goes, I'm certified in Microsoft for, computer programming and different stuff. And he goes, but I was in a home invasion. And he goes, and they put a gun to my head and they tied me up for 6 hours. And he goes, and I've never been able to kind of get my act together since then. And he goes, and a lot of people think that when you're homeless, like you should just go get a job, but they don't realize if you don't have an address, a lot of times you can't get a job without an address, and if you don't have clean clothes because you haven't showered, you can't like go to a job interview. And it's hard for people to actually reach you, and it's not easy for homeless people to just go get a job. And he goes, and I used to be really stressed. And he's like, he just goes into this whole story with me. And he's like, he goes, but he goes, I'm happy though. He goes, I'm really happy. He goes, because I used to worry so much about where am I going to sleep tonight? What food am I going to get? He goes, because every day I got to figure out where I'm going to eat, where I'm going to stay, where I'm going to get kicked out of. And he goes, but I'm really happy. He goes, because I realized that if I'm really worried and really fearful, things work themselves out. And if I'm not worried and not fearful, things work themselves out. He goes, it always works itself out. And I'm sitting there listening to this guy going, like, this homeless guy is teaching me life advice right now, who doesn't have any place to live, that has no money, that didn't have any food until like a few minutes ago when I hang out there all the time now. But I never forgot that, because, and I ended up giving him like $90.
Yeah.
And I was just like, it was just like really, but and I talked to him about places that I thought maybe he could go, because he clearly had PTSD.
Yeah.
And, he goes, I don't drink. He goes, I don't drink, I don't do drugs. He goes, it's just trauma. I mean, he even said that, and I was like, shit, man. But the thing is, like, things always work themselves out.
Yeah.
But when you were saying you can't sit with uncomfortableness, that's the whole thing of, like, when you can't sit with uncomfortableness, you're in a constant state of reaction.
Yes.
And what I've learned through the whole practice of meditation, especially yoga, is, and I've said this before, it increases the space between reacting to life and responding to life. In every situation you can do that increases your ability to respond, the better. And one of my favorite lines from Dan Sullivan over there is, he says, entrepreneurs that are too tightly scheduled cannot transform themselves.
I believe that.
And entrepreneurs or anyone that ties themselves up with drugs or behaviors or the pursuits, when you don't even know why you're pursuing it, other than you just can't sit in the now, your whole life is this constant reaction.
Right.
And the similarities that we have is, we have both sat with very famous celebrities and people that are constantly, the world admires them, and they've made a lot of money and they've created a lot of fame, but there's a shit ton of just their lives are constant reactions or pure boredom. They just they can't even get any juice out of it, so they go into gambling and sex and drugs and power and everything like that.
It was an incredible demystifying experience to sit with these people that you would think would be the happiest, most fulfilled people in the world, and see that couldn't be farther from the truth. There's no way to be where I was for 10 years and to come out of it and be like, oh, well, the answer is to life is to get rich and famous. Like, I know it's not. I've seen it. These are some of the most miserable, emptiest, constantly seeking. And I feel liberated to have experienced that, and to have experienced also like my own small piece of that.
Yeah.
It really opens you up for such a richer life.